All right, we are live.
Good morning, everyone. Welcome to today's meeting, the November 16th meeting of the Revenue Subcommittee of the House Ways and Means Committee. Before we get started, just a couple technical reminders. Please, unless you are speaking, try to keep your microphone on mute so we avoid conflicting noises from different participants in the meeting. Before we go any further, I do want to mention that we are joined by our Chair Atterbury, and to turn to her for a second if she has any words of welcome.
Good morning, everyone. I just want to say it's a pleasure to be here. I am here to listen and learn. I know that is not the protocol typically of the chair in the past to sit in on the briefings, but I'm going to take this opportunity to just listen and learn. If I haven't reached out to you already, I will be reaching out to you to just kind of talk to you and get your thoughts about the committee. And if you have already reached out to me to congratulate me and we've spoken, thank you so much. I really appreciate it. And I really am looking forward to working with all of you. We're going to have an awesome session. We're going to get a lot done and we're going to have some fun too. So looking forward to it.
We appreciate you joining us, Madam Chair, and we're looking forward to the opportunity to show you the excitement of our tax credit evaluation work, which is the most fun you can have in Annapolis. I do want to, before we get started, just add my thanks as well to the chairs, thanks to the members of this committee. I think the last 2 years have been incredibly productive for our work on trying to modernize and rationalize our tax credit and economic development programs. And I think a lot of that work is due to the hard work and the thoughtfulness of the members of the subcommittee. So I appreciate you. And we've got some more work this year. Hopefully it won't be quite as hectic as last year, but we have some more work to do this year. I also want to offer 2 words of thanks to 2 different groups of people who are with us today. First of all, to the Department of Commerce, who continues to be a partner with us in this work, and whose advice and collegiality we deeply appreciate. And finally, and most importantly, to the Department of Legislative Services, who have done such an extraordinary job helping us to understand the impacts of these credits and economic development programs. I do want to mention in particular that Robert Rearman is here with us and is going above and beyond, since he's been a little under the weather lately, but he chose to join us anyway. So he will do his best to present and to answer questions. Thank you, Robert, for going above and beyond and joining us today. We will be looking at these tax credit evaluations one program at a time. Our meeting today is to review the evaluations of 3 different programs: the More Jobs for Marylanders program, the Enterprise Zone Tax Credit program, and the One Maryland Economic Development program. For each of these, we will turn first to DLS to share with us their thoughts and analysis and recommendations. And then for each of them, we will give Secretary Schultz and the Department of Commerce an opportunity to offer their thoughts. And as you know, this is just the first step. I would hope that, unlike at times in the past, we would make sure to take up and have some conversation at least about the different recommendations. The Enterprise Zone program, for example, got a round of recommendations years ago that we never acted on. And I think it's important for us to at least discuss each of them. So I look forward to doing that during the legislative session. So we will start with the briefing on the evaluation of the More Jobs for Marylanders program, and I will turn it over here to Mr. Butler and Mr. Rearman.
Thank you very much, Chair Lukey. Good morning. For the record, once again, my name is George Butler. I'm one of the 3 counselors assigned to the Ways and Means Committee. As Delegate Lukey noted, I'm joined by my colleague, Robert Rearman, who has spearheaded the tax credit evaluation. Tax credit evaluations have been conducted over the years by our department, and we appreciate the opportunity today to present these evaluations. Next slide, please. So we're beginning with the More Jobs for Marylanders program this morning. This program provides state tax incentives and fee benefits for certain businesses that create and maintain a minimum number of qualified positions. The program was established by Chapter 149 of 2017 to provide benefits to businesses that are primarily engaged in manufacturing. 2 years later, Chapter 211 of 2019 extended the program and expanded eligibility to businesses that are located in opportunity zones. Chapter 38 of 2020 then excluded participation by classes of businesses that are ineligible for qualified redevelopment bonds or consideration as opportunity zone businesses. So effectively conforming the expansion of the business, the expansion of the program to the federal opportunity zone program. Next slide, please. In order to participate in the program, a business must either be primarily engaged in manufacturing, excluding refineries, or located in an opportunity zone. The business needs to create a certain number of qualified positions. If the business is located within a Tier 1 area, it must create at least 5 qualified positions. If it's located within a Tier 2 area, it must create at least 10 qualified positions. A qualified position must be full-time in nature. If it's in a manufacturing sector, it must pay at least 120% of the state minimum wage. If the business is located in an opportunity zone, it must pay at least $50,000 annually on average. Tier 1 areas include opportunity zones and counties that for the preceding 24-month period have an average unemployment rate that exceeds the state's average by either 2 percentage points or 150%, or a state median household income that does not exceed 75% of the state's average. In addition, the Secretary of Commerce may also designate up to 3 additional jurisdictions as Tier 1 areas. Next slide, please. So this slide shows the current geographic areas under the program. Tier 1 counties include Baltimore City, Allegheny County, Baltimore County, Caroline County, Cecil, Dorchester, Garrett, Kent, Prince George's, Somerset, Washington, Wicomico, and Worcester counties. The 3 counties that have been designated by the Secretary of Commerce for participation in the program as a Tier 1 area are Baltimore County, Cecil County, and Prince George's County. As you can see, we've also shaded the opportunity zones that are located throughout the state. Once again, those would benefit, those are considered Tier 1 areas as well. Anything that isn't shaded is considered a Tier 2 area. Next slide, please. With respect to program benefits, a new qualified business that's located in a Tier 1 area is entitled to the following benefits for up to 10 consecutive years. First, a refundable state income tax credit for 5.75% of total wages paid for qualified positions. A sales and use tax refund for taxes paid on personal property and services purchased by the qualified business for use at the facility. A state property tax credit for real property owned by the qualified business and located at the project facility. The amount of that credit depends on whether or not the business is in the manufacturing sector or is a business that's otherwise located in an opportunity zone. And then corporate filing fee waivers. An existing qualified business that expands in a Tier 1 or Tier 2 area may qualify for only the income tax credit if that business creates the requisite number of qualified positions. Next slide, please. This slide provides an overview, just in a different format, of those program benefits that we just discussed. As noted, with respect to the state property tax credit for businesses that are located in opportunity zones that are not manufacturers, that property tax credit is limited to either 100% of the property tax due or $250 per qualifying position, whichever is the lesser. And now I'll turn it over to Robert. He'll discuss recent program activity, as well as our department's findings and recommendations with respect to our program.
Thank you, George. The first slide, I'm just going to talk about what kind of program activity we've seen to date. Just want to take a moment and also acknowledge the Department of Commerce. They provided us with a lot of data in this program, which we think is really important to provide members not only information about the program activity, but to evaluate the program. And we see in some other programs, we don't have as much rich data. We can't be as responsive to the General Assembly. So within the More Jobs for Maryland program, I think Chapter 5 evaluation, we can take the information that Commerce provides us and then provide a lot of additional information in terms of who's claiming this, where are they located, what kind of wages they're paying, are these small businesses, large businesses? I'll get into those kind of characteristics. Given its recent enactment, we don't have a lot of data. So what I'll be talking about is the businesses that have claimed the income tax credit from October 2018 through early May 2020. At the time of the evaluation, Commerce advised us that one business was eligible for the sales and use refund, but no company had claimed that to date. In addition, as George mentioned, there were those additional benefits for certain businesses, the corporate filing fee waiver and the state property tax credit. We reached out to SDAT to made several inquiries about the implementation of that, and we did not receive any information. Given that these 42 projects that received their first year credit, almost all of those are existing businesses. So generally, you have to be a new business to qualify for those additional benefits. So we don't believe there's been that activity, but we would like to have some information on that implementation. So these 42 projects in that time frame reported 846 jobs and were awarded a first-year benefit of $3.2 million. Given this is a 10-year benefit, as George mentioned, and wages generally rise over time, we project that these 42 projects will receive a total credit of $37.2 million over this 10-year period. This typical project reported 12 jobs at the Economic Development Project and will receive a total income tax benefit of $340,000 over that 10-year period. So to put that in context, and some of the other similar tax credit programs, two of which we're looking at today, this is significantly more generous than the Jobs Creation Tax Credit, the Enterprise Zone Employment Tax Credit, and the Businesses that Create New Jobs Tax Credit, but is less so than the One Maryland credit that Heather will be talking about later today. And that's even after controlling for differences in the number of employers that are hired and the project size. There is a wide range of businesses that participated in the program. I should mention also of those 42 projects, all but one was a manufacturer. There was only one business, non-manufacturer, located in a federal opportunity zone. So this is really, we're talking about these manufacturers that have participated so far. Chemical, pharmaceutical manufacturers, aerospace and defense contractors, they received about 80% of all credits. This included not only large corporations such as Northrop Grumman and General Dynamics and their subsidiaries, but also some of the smaller defense contractors and subcontractors that are engaged in a lot of different activities throughout the state. When looking at small business participation, it was low by the DLS standard, which is generally 25 employees or fewer. We found that there were two projects that met that threshold, and they received about 1% of all tax credits. Next slide, please. I just want to briefly touch on some of our evaluation findings. Some of these I'm going to go into more detail. The first is that the program objective is not specified in law or regulations. I'll be talking later that one of the annual reporting requirements, I think, gives a strong indication of some of the program aims, but we would like to see that established either in law or regulations, with also measurable metrics for the program. One issue I want to raise attention that probably stressed most in presentation about more jobs, or perhaps all of today, is that there's significant fiscal uncertainty about this program, and it may require future appropriations that will limit the General Assembly's ability to adjust the program's future fiscal impact that is typical of many of the major business tax credits of the state. Also touch on some of the design and implementation issues we thought might limit the program effectiveness. And then talk about some of the program complexity. And also a common theme in our evaluations are, we have several state programs now that share similar objectives. And we were seeing some overlap between those programs and a lack of coordination that will tie into one of our recommendations, is looking at either consolidating or kind of coordinating these programs that aim to alleviate economic distress within the state. Next slide, please. So to go into a little more detail about this potential fiscal impact, as I mentioned, most of the major state business tax credits, the General Assembly has either enacted an aggregate limitation on the amount of credits the administrating agency can award. So for instance, the research and development tax credit, there's a maximum amount that can be awarded in each year. Such as the biotechnology investment incentive tax credit, it's subject to an appropriation that the General Assembly can adjust from year to year to year. Now, the More Jobs for Maryland program does have both of these features, but primarily because this benefit is taken over 10 years, those features do not provide fiscal certainty for the General Assembly. As this program continues to go on and businesses continue to participate, and if the program is extended beyond its current June 30, 2022 eligibility deadline, we're going to have a stacking effect of each subsequent year of new participants and prior year participants. So in essence, the appropriation for the program will likely act in a similar manner as the enterprise zone reimbursement to local governments for 1/2 of the local property tax loss resulting from the tax credit in that program. You know, that program appropriation is not discretionary, but that has to be sufficient to cover not only the first year entrance to the program, but everybody who has participated in their second all the way through the 10th year. So we just want to raise that as an issue of discussion. And again, it does tie into one of our recommendations that the General Assembly may want to consider measures to enhance their flexibility in the fiscal cost of this program. So there is this limitation where Commerce can award in each fiscal year $9 million in income tax credits and $1 million in sales tax refunds. At the time of the evaluation, they had not come close to that limit. I think they were around $3 or $4 million a year. But even so, at the time of the evaluation, Commerce projected that in fiscal 2024, based on existing credit activity to date, the program would require an appropriation of $20 million to offset those tax credit claims. And again, if this program were to continue, that cost will likely rise. And just point two other features why we're discussing this is there's a limited program history here. Not to undercut our arguments in the enterprise zone and One Maryland program, because we also have recommendations to enhance fiscal certainty. We have a 20-year history with those programs. So we have a decent understanding of how they behave. We don't have that here. And also, as George mentioned, in 2019, the program did expand to federal opportunity zones. And as I mentioned, that credit activity that I discussed, where the state had potentially committed $37.1 million to those projects, that was overwhelmingly only manufacturers. We did look at kind of the relative employment bases, and we found that within federal opportunity zones, there are about 3 times as many workers in eligible businesses as statewide employment in the manufacturing industry. So if those businesses participate in a similar manner as manufacturers, that's going to drive up the fiscal impact of this program. And we also do see another parallel with the enterprise zone program, where we think that program's geographic expansion over time has contributed to its rising fiscal impact. Next slide, please. This slide, just want to talk about in detail a little bit more of those credit and design implementation issues. I think more so than any program, if I've been away from this for a little while, or even in the evaluation, I would almost have to start from ground zero. I'd have to consult the map. I'd have to look at the chart we did in terms of who gets what, where. It's like, it has complicated eligibility requirements that we don't typically see in other state tax credit programs. These depend on what type of business you are, new versus existing, and whether you're manufacturing or not. And also, when we looked at that tax credit activity, where it was happening geographically, so far we haven't seen that this tier 1, tier 2 designation has kind of meaningfully impacted tax credit activity. Essentially, unlike the One Maryland program, this has, at least to date, it's been a statewide program. Tier 2 counties have about 46% of the state's manufacturing and employment base. They received a slim majority of tax credits to date, about 52%. So despite those additional incentives in this program, Tier 1 counties have received about 47% of all credits to date. I think kind of some related issues is, even though I mentioned there is no statutory objective, Commerce is required in each year to report the amount that it believes sufficient in the appropriation to support existing manufacturers in the state, attract new manufacturers to the state, and support the expansion of businesses within federal opportunity zones. Given the generous credit, that might entail a dedication of significant amount of state resources to achieve. In addition, with this 2019 expansion, you have a situation where we're using incentives that were originally designed to incent manufacturers, and we're using that to try to achieve substantially different objective, and that's addressing the needs of businesses with different characteristics within federal opportunity zones. And then within the evaluation, we note that this kind of brings a similar parallel with the RISE Zone program, which, as you know, the committee and Commerce and stakeholders worked last year to address, where that program initially took the enterprise zone tools to try to achieve a substantially different objective and meet the needs of businesses with significantly different characteristics, and it was struggling to do so. And as a result of that, there was legislation in the past session to overhaul those incentives in a manner that was thought to better address those businesses' needs. Also, the last credit and design implementation issue I'll touch on is that these incentives can be redundant and uncoordinated with these similar programs. So in the More Jobs for Maryland program, we did see that some of these businesses had previously taken other business tax credit programs, particularly the One Maryland. So it does raise a question of, is this program addressing a new need, or is it kind of covering some ground that's already covered by existing state tax credit programs? Next slide, please. These are our evaluation recommendations. One that is included in all the programs that we're going to talk about today is we do recommend consider consolidating these similar programs, and that would be the More Jobs for Marylanders program, One Maryland, Enterprise Zone, Businesses that Create New Jobs, and Opportunity Zone Enhancement Program. We also, as another alternative, is just kind of raise the discussion of looking at all these programs. Are they offering consistent incentives, and Are they coordinated with each other? And is each program sufficiently differentiated from each other to meet a need that the others are not? As I mentioned, one of the important recommendations is for the General Assembly to consider enacting statutory measures to reduce its fiscal cost and, most importantly, its uncertainty. And along with that, we recommend altering some of the reporting requirements to maybe get a better understanding of the near-term future fiscal impact of the program. And lastly, some of the remaining recommendations is we do recommend reducing its program complexity. And one way that we recommend to reduce its complexity and also maybe reduce some of this overlap with existing programs is to consider targeting the program to smaller sized businesses. As I mentioned previously, for small businesses, there was a relatively small participation. But if you looked at medium-sized employers and smaller size employers, the More Jobs for Marylander initially has had some more success attracting those businesses compared to other state tax credit programs. This is likely due to its relatively low job creation thresholds and a lack of a capital expenditure requirement that's featured in the One Maryland tax credit program. And lastly, we do recommend establishing in statute the objective of the program. Just want to draw a quick contrast with how I view kind of the biotechnology investment incentive tax credit program. And that was another program that was overhauled in the past legislative session. And I think particularly with that overhaul, it's settled into a nice role where even though there are other incentive programs in the state and federal government that provide investment incentives within the biotechnology industry, it's serving a role that complements rather than duplicates these other programs. And then also within that legislation, it established an objective for the program. I think that objective that was established is excellent, and it also includes some metrics that we can assess the success of the program. And we think these are lacking currently in the More Jobs for Maryland program. Thank you, and I'll be happy to take any questions if there are any.
All right. I think let's go ahead and turn to the secretary and allow her to do her response on More Jobs, and then we'll take questions from the members. Members, if you want to ask a question, you can feel free to start using the raise hand function in Zoom, and I'll take you in the order that I see your hands raised. So Madam Secretary, go ahead and just, this is just for More Jobs for Marylanders. We'll do the other ones a little later on.
Of course, thank you, Delegate Lutke, and thank you to Madam Chair for joining us today. Happy to give you some education on this. And for Brad, who is managing the PowerPoint, after I give an introductory here, I believe More Jobs for Marylanders is on slides 7 and 8, if we just want to move to that once I continue with my introduction. So for the record, I am Kelly Schultz, Secretary of the Maryland Department of Commerce, and I'm pleased to be here today to discuss 3 of our department's tax credit programs. And I'd like to thank all of the DLS analysts who worked on these reports for your very thoughtful analysis. And while there are some recommendations with which the department disagrees, there are several which we do agree. So we look forward to continued discussion of these important economic development tools. Before we get into the detailed recommendations regarding each individual program, I would like to just first respond to the very first recommendation, which expressed concerns about overlap between these 3 and other programs and raised the idea of consolidating them. We at Commerce do disagree with this recommendation. This committee knows that I am fully committed to ensuring Commerce's 16 tax credit programs are efficient, effective tools for economic development in the state. Accountability is essential, as is eliminating potential duplication. This has been a priority for me throughout my time at Commerce, and I directed our team to conduct an internal review of our programs when I first became secretary. During last year's session, this subcommittee heard and passed 4 bills that were a direct result of that review and analysis. We believe this is an important conversation, and we certainly do look forward to continuing it. However, Commerce does not feel these programs are duplicative, and we feel that each tax credit is targeted to support a different economic development goal. The One Maryland credit supports and incentivizes large economic development projects in disadvantaged areas of the state. The Enterprise Zone program is essentially a local program that offers real property tax credits in priority areas selected by the local jurisdictions. More Jobs for Maryland specifically incentivizes job creation, mostly in the manufacturing sector, but also within other industries located within opportunity zones. The Opportunity Zone Enhancement Program is not a standalone program. It refers to enhanced benefits within existing programs. The Businesses That Create Jobs program is not a Commerce program, so we cannot exactly speak to that. Each of these programs is tailored to meet a specific economic development need, and we feel that concerns about overlap are mainly unfounded. So I think if we go to slide number 7.
I think they updated it. So
Oh, they
2
did
yeah,
update.
so
Okay.
2 should be the correct slide.
All right,
Yep.
perfect. So I'm just going to speak specifically, Delegate Lutke, on MJM. Just briefly on the program's utilization and success over the last 2 fiscal years. The first 2 in which final certificates were issued, so that would have been 2021. And this chart shows the jobs created and total wages paid to businesses certified in those years of FY20 and FY21. And here are some examples on the next slide of some of the businesses from across Maryland that have taken advantage of this program. There are several recommendations I'd like to address here. Commerce agrees with the recommendation to draft and implement regulations regarding the sales and use tax refund, for example, and we are already drafting those as we speak. We also agree that the program's objective needs to be clarified and spelled out in statute, and we have proposed some language for that. However, there are some points with which we do disagree. In response to recommendation number 2, which calls for lawmakers to consider ways to reduce the program's fiscal cost and to consider allowing the program to terminate. We disagree with this recommendation, and it seems like there may be a fundamental philosophical disagreement between Commerce and DLS in evaluating these programs. We do not consider tax incentives to be a cost to the state because any cost is offset by the other benefits that these jobs bring to the state. For example, in fiscal year 2020, which was the first year Commerce issued final certificates to qualified business entities for this program, we issued 11 certificates totaling $465,543 for the creation of 154 new jobs in the state. Those jobs support another 177 indirect and induced jobs, and together, those 331 jobs support $96.5 million in economic activity and $1.1 million in sales and income tax. That's already a strong return on the cost of the credit. If those jobs remain in place for the full 10-year eligibility period, sales and income tax revenue is estimated at $10.9 million. We have also heard from site selection consultants who are concerned about the sunset date because they have clients making expansions or location decisions based on the availability of this program in future years. We don't want to discourage those companies from bringing their jobs and their investments to Maryland. Recommendation number 3 calls for eliminating the statutory requirement that the governor include an annual appropriation equal to what Commerce reports as the minimum amount needed to support manufacturing and opportunity zone business activities, as well as for amending the reporting requirement. We respectfully disagree with this recommendation as well. This requirement ensures the program has adequate funding in future years since there is no mandated appropriation for the MJM program. Commerce needs this to continue to meet its obligations to businesses using the credit and to those who made expansion and location decisions based on what they expected the credit to be available at that time. We're not clear on the reasoning for the second part of this recommendation, which sounds similar to what Commerce is reporting each summer at the start of the fiscal year. We would like to continue providing a projection report at the start of the fiscal year and then a separate program activity report in December. Recommendation number 5 calls for removing the 2-tier designations and some benefits of the program in order to reduce capacity. We simply have not heard from applicants or interested businesses that the current system is confusing or overly complex. If questions do arise, our staff can easily help applicants understand how the program and the tiers work. However, we cannot speak to those benefits that are not directly administered by Commerce and whether their availability needs to be clarified. Recommendation number 7 calls for limiting the program to smaller businesses. Again, we respectfully disagree. MJM is not a small business focused program, although they are certainly eligible. In fact, the job creation threshold is difficult for many small businesses to reach. There are other incentives available to smaller manufacturers, which do not require the 5 job creation and the retention minimum. And before we get off of this topic of more jobs for Marylanders, I did just want to cite a couple of facts about the number of jobs that have been created. Prior to COVID, between 2015 and 2019, the number of manufacturing establishments increased by 13% through the MJM program. The average annual manufacturing employment increased by 8.2%, and the average annual pay increased by 7.7%. And of course, the annual manufacturing payroll increased by 16.5%. And so the effects from COVID during 2020, average manufacturing employment decreased by 108,000 workers from 2019's high of 112,000. But as of this past March in 2021, employment has recovered to almost 110,000 workers. While total manufacturing employment was affected by COVID, the number of manufacturing establishments continued to increase, with 23 additional establishments opening in 2020. And the average annual pay increased in 2020 to $85,426,000. This could be temporary, but I think the important thing to remember is that Maryland now is the 4th fastest economy for manufacturers in the country. And that is in large part due to the incentives that we're putting out there for Maryland manufacturers, and to be able to keep in mind that the supply chain depends on homegrown manufacturers being able to create those supplies that our neighbors, our friends, and our small businesses actually need. And so we're proud of that fast growing rate. Maryland has never been at that level before, and we want to continue to grow in that economic development industry area. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Madam Secretary. Let me just ask a quick question before we dive into questions from the members. So this program is scheduled to end, I believe, next June. Is the department planning to submit departmental legislation to extend it?
Yes, sir.
Okay, great. Then I will turn first to Delegate Polakovich-Carr.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you, Secretary Schultz, for being here today to talk about this program and the others. I have a question in regards to reporting of outcomes from the More Jobs for Marylanders program. Back in the 2020 session, the General Assembly passed legislation that became law to require more public disclosure of this credit and others through the Maryland Finance Tracker online database. However, it does not appear that any of the data for More Jobs for Marylanders is currently being reported through that database, as well as there's some other just missing information with some of the other tax credit programs, such as average wage information and some other particulars for those programs. Can you or your staff speak to the implementation of that law?
Sure. Actually, I do have two members of my staff here with me today, Delegate Polakovich-Carr. I have Lonnie Sinfield, who is our finance program specialist, and also Jen Lahat, who is our managing director of our legislative group.
And I can jump in to answer this one, Delegate. I just want to make sure, have you been looking at the updated version of Finance Tracker that we implemented that legislation by working with DoIT to create essentially a new Finance Tracker, because the Finance Tracker we had been using was, I think we no longer had the contract with them to continue that. So we have a new version of Finance Tracker now that I will have to double check to make sure the MJM data is in there, but it should be in there through, I think it's the Maryland Open Data Portal. But
if you can share that link,
yeah,
that would be helpful.
I
think I followed the link that was on Commerce's website, so perhaps it was an outdated link I was following, but that would be helpful. Thank you.
Yep, no problem.
All right, Delegate Buckle is up next.
Thank you, Delegate Lutke, and thank you, Madam Secretary, for being with us. I guess my question and comment probably rolled together is the thing that jumped off to me in the DLS presentation and the slides is the suggestion that, you know, we have this system not just in More Jobs for Marylanders, but in other tax credits that we try to make uniform, where we refer to things as Tier 1 and Tier 2 jurisdictions. It used to be called economically disadvantaged, or whatever the terminology was. We changed it to a more softer, gentler Tier 1, Tier 2. And my concern always is this. You know where I live, obviously in Western Maryland. And what we see almost uniformly is that the three areas of the state that are suffering in terms of economic development and growth and high-end growth in 21st century jobs and industries are roughly Western Maryland, particularly the three farthest western counties, parts of Baltimore City that were once formerly heavily industrialized and sort of suffered in the 80s, 90s, turn of the century, and large swaths of the Eastern Shore. And to me, there's a slide there, and I don't know what the department's position is, that the vast majority of the benefits, the awarded credits and the job creation that occurred under the More Jobs program occurred in the Tier 2 counties. And so, you know, there might be a lot of reasons for that. But my fundamental concern is, or my position is, Anne Arundel County is doing okay. Montgomery County, Prince George's County, Howard County, Baltimore County. You look at the population growth and the economic indicators for those counties over the last 30 or 40 years, they're American success stories. But the rest of the state, or a lot of the rest of the state, isn't doing okay. We're falling behind. And so what's the department's position on, you know, is that accurate? You know, do you guys think that's accurate, that the majority of these credits have really been used to facilitate programs in counties that are already actively growing and expanding anyway? A, and B, how can we fix that? Because I'm a huge fan of More Jobs for Marylanders and the concept. I just want to see the utilization of the credits go to help grow areas that need the credits in order to grow. Does the department have any thoughts on that?
Well, Delegate, I think it's a good point. We can certainly get you the complete list of those counties for MJM, the businesses that have been taking advantage of those credits. But I believe that the legislature, in their wisdom, put forward increased incentives in those Tier 1 counties in order to be able to attract businesses to those counties. So incentivizing businesses to go out to those that are in Tier 1 areas is a way of incentivizing maximizing future economic development in those areas. As you know, it is a statewide program. So businesses are incentivized to go to outlying areas, but there's no demand, or there's no mandate for them to do so. So I believe this program and other programs, and looking at, entire economic development strategy for some of those other areas of the state and the tier 1 counties that may be need to be incentivized in other ways, it can't be done simply through a More Jobs for Marylanders program. So that's not a one-stop for being able to increase manufacturing in those areas. There's multiple facets that need to be able to be taken into consideration.
Okay, and I can talk to you more about this online. I mean, I guess my concept is maybe with respect to not just this program, but a lot of tax credit programs, there's not enough of a delta, a differentiation between the value that companies would get from the credit from coming to a true tier 1, a true distressed area, versus what they can get from, we already operate in, in Linthicum out near the airport, and we can just go across the street and start a new operation and we'll get still a certain percentage. That's my perspective, at least, is that the delta, the differentiation between the value of the credits is not sufficient enough to overcome some of the inherent factors that maybe you're alluding to. And I'd love to work with the department on trying to figure out how to make that better. Because, I've talked to you and all the committee many times. I hate to say this. Western Maryland needs these things. For other places, they're nice, but they don't need them. We need them because without them, it makes it very hard for us to compete with our neighbors to the north, to the south, to the west in other states. And it makes it very hard for us to compete against our friends and our colleagues on the 95 corridor. And we're dying. We're dying out here. So whatever we can do to work on that, I really appreciate your efforts and certainly support that.
Thank you, Delegate. I just want to say that at this point in time, because other areas in other tier 1 jurisdictions or even tier 2 jurisdictions are benefiting from the incentive, that does not alone take away the opportunity for Western Maryland to take advantage of them. So because other areas are also taking advantage of it, it does not minimize the ability for Western Maryland to be incentivized with businesses coming to Western Maryland. So I just want to be able to make sure that everybody knows that because other parts of the state are benefiting does not mean that Western Maryland cannot benefit from that. So
sure,
I think we're having a couple of different conversations. So sure.
Well, we can talk more about that, but I appreciate that's something that leaped off the page to me in DLS's report, that the majority of the credits have in fact gone to the tier 2s rather than the places that were sort of prioritized in the original legislative scheme. But I appreciate that. Thank you.
Absolutely.
Thank you, Delegate Buckle. We will go now to Delegate Ivy and then Delegate Feldmark, and then we'll need to move on to the next credit evaluation. Delegate Ivy, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you, Madam Secretary, for being here. I wanted to know if you had any data regarding the racial breakdowns for companies that have been awarded these contracts and that have applied for these contracts. And then separately, because I know that we're trying to move quickly for DLS, as you make recommendations surrounding these tax credits, if you keep small and minority-owned businesses as well in mind. So thank you, Madam Secretary.
Thank you. Of course, small businesses is, definitely something that we are trying to attract all over the state. There is no mandate when businesses apply for any tax credit. As you know, we've talked about this a lot during the pandemic and different types of grants and loans coming out of the Department of Commerce for any business to self-identify. So any data that we have would be incomplete data because there's no mandatory requirement for them to self-identify as minority or otherwise, but we are happy to collect that data and get that to the committee.
Thank you.
Of course.
Thank you, Delegate Ivy. Delegate Feldmark.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you, Madam Secretary. Good to see you again. I guess this may be a question for you or maybe for DLS. Going back to the DLS presentation and for the 42 projects that were evaluated, There was a total of $37.2 million over 10 years in the income tax credit. And I wanted to get a sense, that is a refundable credit. So do we have a breakdown? How much of that 37.2 million is merely foregone revenue, and how much actually exceeded the tax liabilities of the projects receiving the credits?
Well, I will let DLS take a shot at that since it was their slide, but I'm happy to follow up with them after they present their facts.
If I can go ahead and jump in. Delegate, we don't have tax claim data yet, so we're not sure how much has this been, as you mentioned, refunded versus how much offset tax liability. But we can follow up with comptroller as well to see if there is any data since the passage of time from the evaluation.
Okay, wonderful. Thank you. I think that would be helpful if it's possible. Thanks.
And Delegate, if I may, I'm just going to, reiterate something that I mentioned in my remarks, is that the cost to the state, I think there's a difference of opinion as it being an actual cost to the state when if the jobs were not coming, there would not be the additional revenue that would be coming to the state. And when we look at those same programs over the same period of time, the value of those jobs would create over $95 million to the state as far as revenue and other expenses that are benefits that are coming into the state at the cost of that 10-year cost of $10.9 million. So I think it's just a differentiator of the certain types of terms that we use. Had it not be for the jobs, the quote unquote cost would not exist. So, and the additional revenues that have been earned by those job creators, those families that are earning the incomes and the revenues and the additional outlying jobs and the induced jobs would not be in existence.
I appreciate that, Madam Secretary. I just add my own thoughts that I think you're right in cases where we know for sure that the incentives created jobs that otherwise would not have been created. I think the DLS and the legislature have tended to view situations where the jobs might have been created anyway, and we provided the incentive regardless. And the incentive was not the deciding factor as a tax expenditure, right? As something that is, a hit to the state budget in a way that, a job that definitely would not have existed without the incentives, you're correct, brings in new revenue, right? So I think that's the important distinction there. I will turn now to back to Mr. Rearman, and we will turn to our next credit, the enterprise zone tax credit, which could have a 6 or 10 hour hearing all on its own because it's such a large and long-standing and complex program. But we will attempt to get it done relatively quickly. And I know there will be more conversations about the enterprise zone program this session because I know we have members of the subcommittee that have been digging into it a little bit. So I will turn it over to you, Mr. Rearman.
Thank you. I'll be walking through our evaluation and our reevaluation. Next slide, please. So to start off with, there is an established objective for the program. There is a two-part component to the program. It's to encourage economic growth in economic distressed areas and employment of the chronically unemployed in the state. Due to some data limitations that I'll talk about later, we haven't been able to examine whether or not the program encourages economic growth within these distressed areas. However, what a lot of our evaluation concentrates on is to the extent there is additional activity in these distressed areas, is it providing job opportunities for what we term enterprise zone community residents, residents who live in these poverty areas and in proximity to the zones. We conducted our first extensive evaluation in 2014 and in early 2021 published a reevaluation pursuant to the requirements of the Tax Credit Evaluation Act at the time. Since the 2014 evaluation, no substantive legislative changes have been enacted to the program, but there have been these enactment of additional federal and state tax credit with similar objectives such as the More Jobs for Maryland program, the federal Opportunity Zone program, and the Opportunity Zone Enhancement program of the state. Next slide, please. This included this kind of a visualization of kind of the different decisions and approaches that these programs have in terms of designing and implementing a state tax credit program that is trying to address this economic distress areas of the state. Kind of think as the first step is how are you going to designate the zone or the area? So one of those decisions are, do you do it on a county basis? Do you do it purely on a census tract basis? Or in the enterprise zone case, do you do something that's census tract based, but it doesn't have to be wholly within a census tract? And also, what measures do you use to designate these areas? And then lastly, once you designate the zone, what kind of program incentives are you going to provide? How are you going to incent businesses within these zones to locate there and help alleviate that economic stress? So some of these programs we're looking at, we give them a 1-year credit, other a 10-year credit, other we give based on capital, other employment. And I think a crucial question, which we want to raise about these programs is, when looking at them all the years, one of the most difficult questions, and it goes to this but-for question, is how much are we going to compensate firms to locate in these economically distressed areas? And that's one of the issues that we're raising is these incentives are oftentimes not consistent. So a project under one program could be compensated significantly more under one program, even though they're in similarly situated areas of the state. As Delegate Buckle mentioned, even though it might be part of Western Maryland or Eastern Shore or parts of Baltimore City, each of these programs is having a little bit of a different incentive. So they're not consistent and coordinated with each other. Then lastly, if there's any economic activity that's generated from these program incentives, crucially, is there a feedback loop that addresses this economic distress that the state is aiming to reduce? And a lot of our evaluation in the enterprise zone, as I mentioned, that's where we looked at and found that to the extent there is this economic activity, it's not providing a feedback loop for job opportunities for community residents. And along with that, I think there's important policy implications for what is the source of this economic distress. I think in the enterprise zone program, there's this implicit approach that it's a geographic proximity problem. There's just not enough jobs close enough to these individuals who live in these distressed areas. And if we just put more jobs in closer proximity, that's going to create additional job opportunities. And what I'll discuss about later is what we found is since the enactment of the enterprise zone in the early 1980s, we've had a lot of economic change. And primarily, we have a difficulty in the labor market of skills mismatch. There's a mismatch between what is being demanded by employers and what the educational attainment is of the community residents. Next slide, please. First few slides, I'm just going to give a refresher on the different benefits provided by the program. Most significantly is this is a 10-year property tax credit against local real property taxes. And there is also an employment income tax credit. However, the property tax credit does comprise the lion's share of the program's benefit to businesses and the cost to the state. And as I mentioned, the More Jobs for Maryland presentation, the state does reimburse local governments for 1/2 of the local property tax revenue loss that results from that tax credit. Additionally, within the program, focus areas and federal opportunity zones do provide enhanced benefits. When I look to update kind of where the zones are in the state and the focus areas, I believe Commerce's website currently lists that there are 3 focus areas. These are all within Baltimore City. Next slide, please. This is some additional information about the real property local income tax credit. It does start off at 80% in years 1 through 5, decreases by 10% annually thereafter, and is equal to 30% in year 10. And this is a credit based on the percentage of the assessment increase resulting from those real property improvements that the business undertakes, whether it's an expansion of an existing building or it's a new construction. However, in the focus area, that credit is 80% for the full 10-year period, and there is an additional credit for local personal property taxes. Next slide, please. For the income tax credit, there are 2 different tax credits. There's a general income tax credit and a larger income tax credit for hiring economically disadvantaged employees. And again, this does vary based on where the business is located. The regular employment tax credit is taken over 1 year. It's pretty modest, at least compared to these other programs we're going to talk about today. The economically disadvantaged employee tax credit, those values are the total, I believe, over the 3-year period that a business can claim. Next slide, please. Outlining our evaluation findings, as I mentioned, the program does have a valid objective. There are additional, as in the other programs we're going to talk about, the design and implementation issues, we do believe limit the program's effectiveness, particularly in providing job opportunities for residents. Program also lacks fiscal certainty. As I mentioned, the lion's share of the fiscal impact is that reimbursement the state does each year through SDAT. And that is not discretionary. That is the amount that is necessary to cover tax credit activity. Also, I'm going to touch on some of the data issues that continue to limit available program information. This not only hinders our ability to evaluate the program, but also respond to information requests from the General Assembly. I will say that's generally been very frustrating because we're only able to provide limited program information. Essentially, as compared to the More Jobs for Maryland or the One Maryland program, this is a black box in terms of who is claiming it, the characteristics of those businesses, and other information. Next slide, please. In our 2014 evaluation, we took the approach, since we didn't have sufficient data to look at what kind of economic activity was generated, whether or not, to the extent any activity occurred, was this helping provide job opportunities for community residents? And what we found oftentimes is that was not the case, that other areas of the state that were located far from these enterprise zones were much more economically integrated with these zones than the nearby areas and within surrounding the enterprise zone that had high levels of economic distress. And we go into detail looking at the education that was demanded by those employers. We have a lot of statistics in that throughout all the zones, and then how much was possessed by the residents of the zones. We looked at a lot of US Census data to look at that and look at the mismatch between those zones. And we also even found within enterprise zones that were primarily looking at manufacturing or warehousing that may not have demanded as much skills. Those also underperformed and had a skills mismatch among the community residents. We also found that the enhanced income tax credit for economically disadvantaged individuals continues to be underutilized. There have been some issues raised with that tax credit. I believe annually, the Department of Labor that certifies businesses reports that only a handful of companies claim this tax credit. And we also note that in the 2021 evaluation that no substantive changes have been enacted to the program to address this difficulty and providing job opportunities for zone residents. Next slide, please. And I think earlier I talked kind of the difficulty in kind of defining and targeting economic distress. And within the enterprise zone program, we don't believe a single measure is sufficient to accurately identify economic distressed areas. Typically for the enterprise zone, it's based on a poverty standard. And one issue that we also find problematic is areas that do not meet program requirements can be included so long as the entire zone meets a program requirement. So that might also contribute to the program's geographic expansion. And I think this also gets to some of the question about the but-for. A lot of the research that we've looked at is these programs are most effective in promoting activity that would not have otherwise occurred if it's in the most distressed areas of the state. And what we found when we were actually looking at our historic revitalization tax credit is that enterprise zone projects within Baltimore City were much less likely to occur within the neighborhoods that had the most economically distressed indicators. The historic revitalization tax credit, if you will, kind of outperformed the enterprise zone program in that although that program's objective is to revitalize and rehabilitate historic structures, those projects occurred in more distressed neighborhoods. So that's the issue we want to raise. Is it's really important to think about how we are targeting and measuring this economic distress to try to enhance the program's effectiveness. Next slide, please. Next two slides have just some additional information about the program fiscal impact. So since fiscal 2001, we estimate there's been about $600 million in combined state and local fiscal impact. So I think of the programs that DLS has evaluated, that probably is the largest, or certainly one of the largest that we look at. We also estimate in fiscal 2021 that the combined state and local fiscal impact will be 55.1 million. And so if you can go to the next slide, it'll kind of show this, both the increase in the fiscal impact. So you've had basically a tenfold increase in the program's fiscal impact since 2001. And you can also see the relative importance of the property tax reimbursements as compared to the income tax credits. Now, although the income tax credits do comprise a relatively small portion of the program's fiscal costs, in recent years, annually, there's been about $800,000 to $1 million in tax credit claims. Next slide, please. Just have additional information about these program data limitations. Commerce, I believe, in their annual reports highlight this as an issue, that there's local governments in some instances don't have employment and capital investment information, or there's not a report at all. And we have a comparison of what we are able to report across each program. And in the enterprise zone program, we're only able to report some very limited information compared to other programs. Next slide, please. So evaluation recommendations, there again is this the consideration of consolidation, or thinking about how these programs interact. We also believe that the General Assembly should consider establishing new criteria for determining zone designations, and importantly, zone expansions. Reduce administrative burdens to claiming the income tax credit. Refers to the economically disadvantaged tax credit that doesn't seem to be effective at this point in time. We also recommend enacting measures to increase the program fiscal certainty. But I do caution, I think this has been a difficult question Again, since this program has been around for a number of years, there has been some thoughts about how to implement this, and it is difficult. And also thinking about ways of how to improve employment opportunities for enterprise zone residents, particularly those in poverty, as an additional recommendation. And we'd also like to kind of get at this lack of information that we're getting from this program. I do think it is difficult because unlike a program that is solely housed within Commerce, there is both Commerce that is more of an, I think it's fair to say, oversees and administers this program. SStat calculates the property tax credit for local, and then local governments implement it. So we have a bunch of different entities involved in this that could make this goal difficult, but we would like to see some additional program information. Thank you.
All right, thank you, Mr. Rearman. For the members, to add to what Mr. Rearman said, a lot of what DLS, Mr. Rearman just presented, tracks pretty well with the economics literature on enterprise zones. Enterprise zones are not unique to Maryland, and consistently, the majority of economic studies, including studies by right-leaning think tanks like AEI and Cato, have said the same thing, which is there's not a lot of evidence that enterprise zones alleviate poverty or create significant numbers of new jobs, although they have other impacts. So, this is a substantive issue that we need to figure out if we're going to continue to use enterprise zones, how to make them effective, or are there alternatives to particularly the job tax credit that hasn't been heavily utilized. But I'll turn it over now to Secretary Schultz for the departmental response.
Great. Thank you so much, Delegate. But before I address the specific recommendations, I would just like to give a brief overview of the program's success over the last 3 years. And I think we do have a slide of the last 3 fiscal years that we can put up for enterprise zones specifically. But anyway, this program, it's more difficult for us to directly address the utilization other than the designation of zones. Contrary, I'm sorry, to what DLS had just said, Commerce does not administer the programs. So Commerce, our role is to be able to help with the designation of zones. So it is the local jurisdictions that do the administrations. And what we will show you, if you come up, I don't know what slide it is, could be slide number 5, but there's an enterprise zone utilization and successes that shows each fiscal year. It's included the number of businesses approved for the real property tax credit. There it is. Thank you, Brad. I appreciate that. These are the real property taxes, the tax credits, the number of jurisdictions which received the reimbursements, and the total amount of capital investment in the state's share of property tax reimbursements. So that is just a snapshot of the last 3 fiscal years of what those projections are. And on the next slide, it's just an example of some of the businesses from across Maryland that have taken advantage of the program and the different enterprise zones. And I just want to touch on some of the specific recommendations real quick that DLS made about the program. You do, again, have our full responses that had been delivered to the committee, and happy to address any questions. But recommendation number 2 suggests a statutory change in this program to try to boost employment for residents of the opportunity or of the enterprise zones. And we respectfully disagree with this recommendation because the primary focus of this program is not on job creation itself, but on spurring redevelopment in distressed areas of the state. The improvements from these projects are intended to benefit the surrounding communities and residents and spur additional redevelopment. Commerce works with our sister agencies, such as the Department of Labor, to ensure that job training programs address the needs of businesses in the state, such as programs like the EARN program, which we've talked to this committee a lot about at Labor, and the Partnership for Workforce Quality, or PWQ, which is housed at Commerce. Those are just 2 of the programs that we use to meet those needs. While Commerce does not administer the hiring portion of the enterprise zone program, we do not agree that a burdensome administrative process is decreasing utilization. Lower utilization may be due to other factors, and we are not aware of administrative burdens that could be lifted. That's not something that we're hearing from our local jurisdiction partners. Recommendation number 4 calls for a statutory change to provide evaluation criteria for the expansion of the zones. Again, Commerce disagrees with this recommendation. We don't believe we should apply a uniform standard for zone sizes across the state because each jurisdiction has different priorities, assets, and considerations when designating a zone. The size of a zone itself is not an indicator of how many incentive dollars are going into the zone. Geography and population density can cause zone sizes to vary significantly. And when you looked at one of the original maps that DLS had put up prior to this, you could have seen some of those changes in the sizes. And then finally, recommendation number 6 calls for Commerce to work with SSTAT to adopt metrics and clear quantifiable measurements of a zone's effectiveness. Again, we disagree with this recommendation because, as mentioned earlier, each zone is different and designed according to the unique needs and circumstances of the local jurisdictions. Once Commerce designates each zone, this is essentially a local program, and we're very hesitant to try to evaluate each zone by one set standard type of criteria. Furthermore, there is a time lag between designation and revitalization, and the timeline from one zone to another could vary substantially. So just want the committee to keep those issues in mind, but happy to take questions, Mr. Chair.
Thank you very much, Madam Secretary. Are there any questions from the members? We will, I think, be having further discussions around enterprise zones during session. So
I have absolutely no doubt.
yeah. I see Delegate Feldmark's hand.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And I'm not sure if this is something you can speak to, Madam Secretary, or if it's probably more at the local level, but I guess I'm just curious, and maybe even if DLS has a sense of how other enterprise zones work, you know, in terms of the mismatch of the jobs and the residents of the zones, are there, like, what exists in terms of referral or connector services to try to improve that? You know, is that a piece of this program within each jurisdiction, or are there models for that, perhaps from other states if we don't do that currently here? Can you explain to me a little bit what you mean about a referral system, Delegate? Something to help make the connection between the residents of the zone and the employers who are locating there, right? You know, are they just doing a general employee recruitment through normal means? Is there any focus on the disadvantaged residents within the district, or any services, you know, from a workforce development side of things, helping those employees connect to the opportunities that are being created within the zone?
Sure, and I'll try to address that, but I'm sure we'll have plenty of opportunities during session with the local jurisdictions as well. But having served as both the Labor Secretary and the Commerce Secretary, I can talk about what happens at the state level and how it's duplicated down in the local jurisdictions as well. So when you have a new opportunity that comes in the state, then that comes through the local jurisdiction, whether it's the county's economic development office, or in many of the jurisdictions, you know, have a private entity, which is their economic development arm of the county. So when that occurs, there is also in each jurisdiction a workforce development, a workforce training office, and a local workforce development board. So what the counties should be doing, those jurisdictions, is once there are those opportunities, then those opportunities become available to the LWDBs, the local workforce development board, and then they start their recruitment and their process. They know they are the subject matter experts when it comes to the parts of their state and the employment opportunities that should be made available to their local either unemployed or underemployed residents of that specific county. But I do want to go back just very briefly and just say that the enterprise zone is not mainly a job creation tool. It's a rehabilitation and revitalization tool for distressed areas in order to be able to attract business into those parts of the state that are in some type of desperate need for additional redevelopment or development. And I just want to be able to make sure that we understand that, because similar to what Delegate Buckle had said about being able to attract businesses to Western Maryland, we want to be able to make sure with programs like the Enterprise Zone that you're attracting businesses into those zones, so then it can be able to create that more profitable redevelopment area for more businesses to want to be able to come in order to be able to take advantage of other types of job creation programs. So I don't know if that helps at all, but it's the entire process and ecosystem of economic development. It's, you know, kind of equating it to what comes first, the chicken or the egg. Hate to put it so simply that way, but wanting to be able to make sure that there's something there in order for the development to be able to begin. And I think that many of the local jurisdictions are looking forward to having this conversation during sessions so that they can talk about some of their specific success stories.
Thank you.
Of course.
All right. I see no other hands. So we will move on to our final evaluation presentation of the day, which is the briefing on the evaluation of the One Maryland Economic Development Program. And we will turn things over to Heather McDonough.
Thank you. So the One Maryland program is a reevaluation. We did our first evaluation back in 2014. The One Maryland program was established in 1999 to assist businesses with the cost of economic development projects in economically distressed counties. It's a high value, low utilization tax credit. So there's only been 79 projects, but they've been awarded $305.1 million in credits. The credit is 100% of the project cost up to a cap is capped at $5 million per project, or $5.5 million if it's in a federal opportunity zone. And credits can be carried forward for 10 years and become partially refundable beginning in the 5th year. Next slide. The cap is based on the qualified positions. So it's a tiered structure. It varies up to a $1 million cap if you create 10 positions, and goes up to $5 million or $5.5 million if you create 50 or more positions. The $5.5 million is if it's in a federal opportunity zone in Allegheny, Garrett, Somerset, or Wicomico counties. Next slide. During our 2014 evaluation, our major findings were that there is uncertain but significant fiscal costs. The credit is complex and difficult to administer, and there's variation in credit effectiveness. Next slide. Since then, we've had some major legislation in 2018 that significantly changed the program. It's chapters 583 and 584. It did a number of things, such as eliminating the $500,000 startup credit. It established the tier structure based on the number of qualifying positions. It reduced the credit carry forward period from 14 years to 10 years. Next slide. And another thing to note is that it requires the business entities to report the amount of tax credits claimed to Commerce. Next slide. In 2019, there is also legislation to increase the maximum credit to the 5.5 million if it's within a federal opportunity zone in those counties listed. Next slide. So chapter 3 of our report discusses some of the program fiscal impacts. There's been 79 projects through May of 2020, and they've totaled $305.1 million in credits. So on average, that's about 4 projects per year, totaling 15.8 million in credits. Next slide. There's been a lot of fluctuation though over the years. You can see it's peaked in 2016 at 48 million. But then in 2019 calendar year, there is a 0 credit, so it kind of varies a lot. Next slide. And the typical One Maryland project is awarded a credit of 4.8 million. A lot of these are large projects, so more than 2/3 of projects have earned a credit of over $5 million. And the number of jobs certified has ranged from 19 to 249 jobs, with a typical project reporting 43 jobs. Next slide. The 2014 evaluation found a large pipeline of unclaimed credits. Only about 1/3 of credits had been claimed. And it also found that the program lacked sufficient fiscal controls. The 2018 legislation reduced some of the tax credits complexity and fiscal uncertainty by doing things such as eliminating the startup costs, reducing the time frame to claim the credits, and allowing the credit to be claimed against the business income instead of the project's income. But there's still significant fiscal uncertainty due to the facts that Commerce may award unlimited credits. Companies receive a large credit that's claimed over multiple years, and the value of the credit is determined upon project certification. Another big issue is that we don't have data on whether the credits being awarded are actually being claimed, and like how much has been claimed. It's very unclear about how much has been claimed. Next slide. One of the big things to know about the program is that it does not have a limitation on the number of credits that can be awarded. We've looked at a number of business tax credits, and the One Maryland program stands out from not having an aggregate limitation or a budget appropriation. Next slide. You can see some of the tax credits here in the left column have an aggregate limitation, and in the middle are the ones with a budget appropriation. And so the One Maryland really is an outlier compared to other business tax credit programs. Next slide. In chapter 4 of our report, we talk about the program activity. Since our last evaluation, there's been 25 new projects. And so since our last evaluation, there was some slow activity in 2013 and 2014, and then it peaked in 2016 and then slowed down again. Baltimore City is the largest recipient of project assistance. There's been 48 Baltimore City projects, and they've received over 60% of the credits. In recent years, the program activity has shifted away from the Eastern Shore to Western Maryland, and most projects are in manufacturing and transportation or warehousing industries. Next slide. Chapter 5 of our report discusses credit effectiveness and implementation issues. The OLA did an audit of Commerce recently and found that Commerce did not verify new positions, and that they certified a credit based on ineligible project costs. Since then, Commerce has taken steps to remedy these issues. So they now verify employment by obtaining the quarterly unemployment insurance reports with the Maryland Department of Labor. And they've also hired a compliance officer that performs employment verification. Next slide. The 2014 evaluation found that the design of the tax credit led to significant cliff effects between companies with similar projects that did and did not qualify for the credit, which led to significant variation in the reported creation of jobs, wages paid, and cost effectiveness among projects. And despite the 2018 changes, there's still significant cliff effects, and cliff effects are should be avoided as they produce inconsistent incentives. Next slide. We also performed a REMI analysis on the One Maryland program, looking at before the 2018 changes and after the 2018 changes. And we found that there is the 2018 changes made at best a modest improvement into the program. There is a 2.2% improvement in employment, a 1.4% increase in GDP, and a 2.3% increase in disposable personal income. The 2018 legislation also reduced the time period from 14 years to 10 years. And so we looked at that and found that reducing the time period lowered unemployment, GDP, and disposable personal income by about 2 or 3% in the short term, but over the long term, there was no meaningful impact of doing so. Next slide. And so these are the actual REMI results. So like I said, creating the tier structure had a 2.2% improvement in employment, 1.4% improvement in GDP, and a 2.3% improvement in disposable personal income. Next slide. And so that leads us to our recommendations. As Robert has mentioned, we recommend that Commerce and the Maryland Department of Labor submit a report on consolidating or eliminating the state tax credits. And then if the One Maryland program isn't consolidated or eliminated, then we recommend that it should be subject to an annual state budget appropriation, which would help address a lot of the fiscal uncertainty about the program. Next slide. We also recommend that Commerce report terminated projects, which should help clarify state liabilities. And we recommend that the comptroller clarify the treatment of tax credit carry forwards, because the tax credit carry forwards get lumped together with other tax credit carry forwards. And so it's hard to know which carry forwards are related to which credit. And issuing a project identification number would help also track the carry forwards. And next slide. We also recommend that businesses report more employment data. So if they, claim, report 10 new positions. We don't know whether that's a small business or whether it's a large business that just created only 10 new positions. We also recommend that the Maryland Insurance Administration provide more information to us on the Comptroller's Office. And lastly, we recommend that Commerce should comment on how the 2018 legislation has affected the program and how to redesign the program to avoid significant cliff effects and to more accurately be able to predict the revenue loss in each year. So with that, I'll turn it over to Commerce and for questions.
Sure. Madam Secretary, go right ahead.
Great. Thank you so much, Delegate. And thanks to Heather and the great analysis of the program. On the screen, we do have for you, before I get into the recommendations, just for your understanding of the last 4 fiscal years of where we are. I'm going to have to go back, quite frankly, Delegate Lutke, because on the charts that I saw that DLS had submitted, it showed a difference in the utilization in especially FY19 from what our charts show. So I have my team, we're going to look into that and just see where the discrepancies are. But here you can see where the utilization has been. Those 5 projects represent a combined 281 new jobs that have been created. Emphasize new jobs. Sometimes we have this conversation where it's, existing jobs, and they would have gotten, they would have stayed in Maryland or gotten Maryland anyway to be able to produce revenues in the state. But these are new jobs, over $60 million in project costs and over $18 million in new wages. The next slide shows you some of the businesses across the state that have taken advantage of One Maryland. Some of those names on there might be of interest to some of you on the Zoom today. Commerce's economic impact analysis of the certificates issued in fiscal year 20 showed that the company's reported creation of 111 new jobs and eligible projects of $8.6 million supported a total of 248 jobs, $51.9 million in economic activity, and over $900,000 in annual state tax revenues. Now, I'd like to specifically address 2 of the recommendations. And of course, again, you do have our written response to all of the recommendations. Recommendation number 2 calls for the amount of credits Commerce can certify each year to be subject to an annual state budget appropriation. Again, we disagree with this recommendation because of the unpredictable nature of how this credit is claimed each year. And we cannot be certain how many projects will be completed in a given year and how many will apply for final certification that year. Projects could face unexpected delays for a number of reasons, and the number of qualified positions in a given project may increase or decrease in any given year for a variety of reasons as well. All of this would make it very difficult to predict how much credit will be claimed each year, and therefore how large the program's annual appropriation would need to be. We do not want to be in a position where a company has spent years fulfilling its obligations to receive the credit, then face a delay in getting the final certificate because the appropriation ran out. Recommendation number 10 asks Commerce to comment on redesigning the program to avoid cliff effects, which DLS asserts could create stronger incentives for businesses and improve utilization of the program. We disagree that avoiding potential cliff effects should be a major focus when structuring a business incentive program. DLS raised the concern of imposing different tax liabilities on businesses in a similar situation, but we feel that is the point of an incentive program. There needs to be a clear benefit for the business to take these steps to help improve the state's economy. In this program's specific case, those steps are creating jobs and spending capital, and the benefit to them is the tax credit. We would also like to note that since the amount of the tax credit is equal to the withholding paid for qualified positions over the year, there is an incentive to create more jobs than the minimum job threshold. A company may not fully utilize the credit over the 10 or 14-year period without adding more jobs. That is the incentive for the state. And if I may, Mr. Chair, just very briefly in concluding, I believe this is the last program being administered today or reviewed today. Commerce does welcome continued discussion from this subcommittee, from the committee in general, and of course with the entire legislative body to make sure that all of our programs are effective as possible. Across state government, we should always be asking ourselves if we can be doing things better. And of course, there's always a better way to do some things. And we welcome and agree with many of the recommendations, contrary to what my testimony showed today. But what they have proposed for the programs, and we don't want to jeopardize the success, of course, of all of our tax programs and the ability to retain, grow, and attract businesses from other states. They do get results. We are getting results. They create and support jobs, and they support investment in our state. And they are important tools for our economic development efforts in Maryland. And I'm happy to take questions on this program or programs in general, Mr. Chair.
I appreciate that, Madam Secretary, and appreciate, as always, the willingness of Commerce to engage in these frank conversations about the programs and how they can be improved. Quickly, are there any departmentals coming in this session related to One Maryland?
I don't believe so.
Okay.
I believe we have hit the deadline, but I don't believe that there's anything for One Maryland.
So to the members, so far as I know, there's not currently a vehicle for conversations about One Maryland. There's a departmental for More Jobs for Marylanders. I know there's a legislator working on legislation related to enterprise zone. But if the members are interested in potentially having a conversation about reforms to One Maryland, a member would need to step up and introduce some sort of legislation to serve as a vehicle for that conversation. So just to plant a seed, please let me know if you want that member to be you. Are there any questions from the members regarding the One Maryland program? Delegate Polakovich-Carr.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. One quick question. Actually, this is a follow-up for DLS. I think one of the slides mentioned that the 2019 audit findings, Commerce has addressed those. Can you, or maybe this is for Commerce, can speak to where those regulatory changes are in terms of what eligible project costs are? Have those regulations been promulgated already, or are they in drafting right now?
Delegate, this is Lonnie Sinfield. I wanted to address your concern. The One Maryland regulations are in draft form and they're internally being reviewed. And we hope to push them through within the next year. That's the status. And all of the other measures we've addressed the DLS audit findings to become compliant.
Thank you.
Any further questions? Delegate Bulger, you had your hand up earlier, or was it?
No, I think that my question was addressed about whether there's departmental. I mean, I'm a big fan of One Maryland. I think you all know that because it is one of the few programs that really is directed towards those distressed areas and counties that have a history of that. So happy to work with people on any concerns about it. But I think that was addressed in the Secretary's remarks.
Sure. Any further questions from the members? Well, seeing none, Madam Secretary, we really appreciate your time today and your feedback, and we look forward to continuing these conversations during the legislative session. Mr. Rearman, Mr. Butler, Ms. McDonough, thank you so much for your hard work on these presentations. It's always deeply appreciated. And to the members, we'll see you in Annapolis in what, like 20 days, like 2.5 weeks, we'll be there. So we'll see you then. And then I don't expect significant revenue subcommittee work during the special session. So we'll look forward to actually getting to work on some of these in January. That concludes our meeting. Everyone have a wonderful day.